Welcome to Cinemophile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemophilepod.com. Third Act is an insightful and heartfelt film that showcases a personal story about the director's relationship with his legendary filmmaker father, Robert Bob Nakamura, a pioneer in the world of Asian American cinema. He's also known as the Godfather of Asian American cinema. Third Act is a moving and beautiful story about Bob's journey together with his filmmaker son Tadashi Nakamura as they embark to make their film together. Beautiful film, touching story, a story of a father and a son and a family, and so much more. The film again is called Third Act, and we're joined today by the director, Tadashi Nakamura. Tad, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Tad, thank you for joining us. This film is, as I said in the introduction, heartfelt, heartwarming, beautiful look back on the life of your father, his journey, knowing what he was dealing with. When you were considering doing this film about him, was there a moment when you went from wanting to do this to having to do this film?
Yeah, I've definitely, it's something that was always in the back of my mind. I always knew that someone had to make a film on my dad, and I always felt, I was the best person to do that. But it wasn't actually until, because my dad and I were so close. We worked together almost every day. But there was a moment when I moved to Arizona for a couple years. I think it was then that I could only talk to him on the phone. I couldn't, just be with him. So I think because our conversations were on the phone, I would notice these pauses where I would notice he just wasn't speaking as quickly as he normally did. It was nothing drastic, but because I knew him so well, I could tell. I think everyone, the rest of my family kind of noticed that too, but we kind of chalked it up to old age. At that time, he was getting close to 80. There had been no Parkinson's diagnosis at all. He had been dealing with depression for a while, but I think it was at that point that once he was getting slower, once he started forgetting things a little bit, that was kind of a shock to the system for me. And just, I realized it would kind of be now or never, just at least start recording his interviews.
The arc of the story is certainly about your dad, Robert, but it also brings into the conversation your grandfather, Ji-chan, into the conversation for us to get this broader context of the Japanese American experience, but also just a very personal family story. But all of these things are interrelated. Your grandfather is obviously an important person in your family. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship he had with your father and the relationship you had with him as well.
So I was actually, I think, sophomore in college. So I was probably early 20s when my Ji-chan passed away. So I was, very grateful to have him for most of my childhood. But because, English was his second language, he was kind of this nice, cuddly grandpa that would, give me ice cream every time I would go over to his house, and would watch the Dodger games and kind of keep to himself. So it wasn't until I saw my dad's film, Watari Dori, Birds of Passage, that actually saw him, my Ji-chan or grandfather, as a vibrant, younger man who was part of this community, who was a gardener, a judo instructor. I think it was through that film that I actually saw his struggle. Because my grandparents would never, unless I brought it up, would never talk about what happened to them during World War II or all the racism they faced. But my dad would explain to me what happened to them. It was, on one hand, I knew him, but in this other very specific grandfather to grandson relationship. And it wasn't until I saw my dad's film on him that I really saw him as not only part of history, but someone that had really sacrificed and gone through a lot to put myself and my sister in the position we were able to grow up in.
This is kind of the through line. Your telling of the story, the third act, is how important documenting these events in your life and your family's life. And again, as I alluded to earlier, the broader story that's being told here about the Japanese American experience. Your grandfather Jishan, his, I'll call it nobility, his willingness to sacrifice so much, and the racism and abuse that he experienced. These things are, to me, this level, any kind of trauma is lasts for who knows how long in someone, but this generational trauma your family has experienced is hard to imagine.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah, because I think that's exactly what it is. It's, for my dad, it was childhood trauma. For our family, it's generational trauma. And I think what I realized making this film is that, like you said, I didn't realize how much my dad was still suffering from that trauma. I didn't realize how broken my dad still was, even, in his mid to late 80s, having had this long career of documenting the Japanese American experience, specifically in World War II, processing that with collectively with other activists and artists during the Asian American movement of the late 60s and early 70s. He had done all that, but yet it was still very apparent to me when we started making this film, how easily he could be triggered. And even, intellectually, I think he could understand that what happened and why it happened and the historical and institutional racism that played in that. But yet, I think on the emotional level, he still felt this shame. He still felt this guilt. And I think, but also I think what I was realized is along with that generational trauma, there's also this generational empowerment. So I think for me, as much as I inherited this history, this trauma, this anger, this frustration, I feel like I also inherited this element of community, of activism, of empowerment, and specifically empowerment through film and through telling stories, through documentary, through capturing images on camera. So I think it kind of works both ways. Luckily for me, is that, again, definitely am dealing with that same trauma that most Japanese Americans are still dealing with. But luckily, there's also this legacy of activism, specifically through filmmaking, that to carry on.
Yeah, I think you're alluding to, at least what comes to mind when you're talking about the sense that your father had of this resiliency, this coming to terms with it, is in the film, I believe the last time you were at Manzanar, and what he talks about there, just where he was in terms of that in his life and how it impacted him. But I cannot imagine the kind of long-lasting impact something like being imprisoned, not for anything that I did, but for who and what I appear to be to the government, to other people in the community that I live in. Those kinds of things are enveloping in terms of someone in their ability to move through their own lives. Manzanar is a war crime as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm.
We didn't do it to the Germans. We didn't do it to the Italians. We imprisoned people because they were Japanese Americans. And there's just something that we've never ever come to terms with in this country. I used to drive by Manzanar all the time. I didn't know what it was.
Mhm.
I used to live in Mammoth. I lived there
Oh,
for three
wow.
years, and I drove past it all the time. And I saw a monument of some kind. I always wondered what it was.
Mhm.
And again, and the reason I'm bringing this into the conversation is because I should be aware of this. I should have been aware of this when I was in grade school, for
Mhm.
God's sake.
Mhm.
So, again, if you want to comment on any of that, I can't imagine that we are so bad at reconciling with our sins in this country. It's an incredible deficit that we live in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree in terms of, I don't think it's coincidence that, our government tried to sweep it under the rug, right? Tried to not teach about it because, because even when, so my dad, when he made a photo exhibit, and this was in the late 60s, where it was a photo exhibit, kind of an installment, a sculpture of photos from the camps. And those were government photos, but those were the first time any of those photos were publicly displayed. And this was, not that long ago. This was just in the late 60s. And I think what's hard for me to even realize is up until that first pilgrimage to Manzanar that's in the film in 1969, some people who were denying that even happened because there was nothing in the history books, because there was no quote unquote evidence at that time. People thought we were making it up. It was so buried that even Japanese Americans did not know it happened. So even a lot of people whose parents were incarcerated during World War II, they didn't even know that happened to their parents because it was one, there was nothing, in the news or education system about it, but also two, within the community, it was a huge point of shame. I think my dad would always say, it's like literally having a prison record. That's not something you're gonna openly talk about and bring up, during Thanksgiving dinner. And if anything, it's something that you hide. Or even worse, I've heard the analogy is to, a victim of sexual assault, where there's almost this shame and guilt about it. But for sure, you're not going to bring it up, or it's for sure you're not going to tell your kids about it. So yeah, like you said, it was this huge traumatic event that I think our country, obviously has not come to terms with it because we're doing it currently to other communities. So when I see people being detained, ICE agents coming and taking people away, that reminds me very vividly of the story of, of my Ji-chan having to burn everything that had to do with Japanese anything because he didn't want the FBI to come pick him up. And that's, unfortunately, history is repeating itself. And we were talking about historical trauma. When I read the news, all I could see is 2 generations from now, people are still going to be dealing with what's happening to their families today.
I was going to bring that up about your Jichon burning and hiding everything about the family, and I can't imagine. I can't imagine the level of fear and you said shame. I think that's exactly the uh, the after effect of all of this. I do thank you for talking about that, but I also want to celebrate the relationship you have with your father, with your family, the community that you are a part of. You have your own family now. The film Third Act is about family. It's about growing. It's about perseverance. It's about love of each other. So I want to focus on that as well. I know there's so much trauma we've been talking about, but to see you and your father work together, to see he seemed like such a great person to want to be around, and the willingness on his part to impart what he could to you, what he did impart to you about filmmaking and about life.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think from originally, I just wanted to make a film, kind of a straight biography about my dad. But, once he got diagnosed with Parkinson's disease kind of early on in production, it really became more of using the film to allow both of us to process this third act of his life, meaning dealing with his own mortality, dealing with Parkinson's itself, but even for me, becoming a father, learning to kind of be more of a professional filmmaker, for a family that is very much a filmmaking family, where that's pretty much the family business. I think even though we didn't intend to necessarily make a film about our family, it makes perfect sense why it ended up being that. I think my dad always told me to, make films, number one, of what you're passionate about and will excite you, but also what you have access to. And we really leaned into that, because there was a discussion at one point if we should have interviews or people from outside the family, scholars, my dad's colleagues, film critics and things like that. But I think there was a point where we really realized that, in its core, this is a father and son film, that we made a conscious decision just to keep it very insular. And, the only people that you're hearing from is basically me and my dad and my mom, and sometimes my son. But I think because of that, I think people are very feel like they get to know the family because it is such an insular film.
And yeah, I felt like we did. I just want to remind our listeners that we're speaking with Tadashi Nakamura. He is the director of a documentary film called Third Act. It is a story of his family, his relationship to his father, father's relationship to his family, and beyond. And it illuminates so much more. And having said what you just said, I do want to at least acknowledge and point out that as a filmmaker, I think it's fair to say that Hirohata Raised the Banner was his breakout film in terms of recognition, or would it be Manzanar? Which film would you point to in terms of his filmography?
It's a good question because I think now, historically, I think Manzanar is probably his most recognized film, only because it was the first film on the Japanese American World War II experience by a Japanese American. Recently, it was chosen to be added to the National Film Archive by the Library of Congress. I definitely think, Hito Hata Raised the Banner again was as well as groundbreaking. It was the first feature narrative film by and about Asian Americans. For him, that was his attempt and visual communications attempt to try a narrative form, try fiction filmmaking. And I think because of that, at that time, it was really groundbreaking. Had, some of the top Asian American actors at the time, like Pat Morita and Mako. But I think for my dad, he did that, and then he did another short narrative. But then he went back to making documentary films, and specifically, he went back to making short form documentary films because he felt that could be used the most in classrooms, in workshops, or would be the most accessible. So I think for my dad, I think for him, that helped him realize what the kind of films he wanted to make. And I think for Hito Hata, it kind of proved to him and the community that we can make narrative feature films. But my dad eventually went back to documentary films.
You mentioned visual communications. I do want to acknowledge that he co-founded that organization and the ongoing support that they have provided for artists since 1970. So we're going back now 50 plus years, 55 years of support of the arts, the media arts in this community. Also his connection to UCLA, the School of Theater and Film and television, and so much more. The legacy that he left behind in terms of paying it forward to people in this thriving community. Let's talk just a little bit about the importance to him of leaving this legacy of support for the arts.
He really always had this vision of communities being able to tell their own stories for themselves through film. And I think he spent most of his career creating those films himself for the Japanese American community. And then I think he spent the rest of his life really dedicating to training others to do the same for their communities and building institutions to help them do that. So it was really that same vision that started visual communications, and then he brought that same vision to the Japanese American National Museum, and him with my mom founded the Watase Media Arts Center, which is pretty much a production company within the Japanese American National Museum that not only produces long form and short form documentaries, but also does all the archival and media for the exhibitions. So I'm actually currently the director of the Watase Media Arts Center, and so literally kind of took up the family business, took up the family shop. But then also at UCLA, he founded the Center for Ethno-Communications in the Asian American Studies Department. He was a film professor at UCLA Film School for years, but he felt that ethnic studies, Asian American studies students should also be able to learn how to, make basic documentary films because of what the content they were studying and producing, and which still currently exists today. There's numerous filmmakers that he's mentored, like Justin Lin, but specifically the institutions that he built are all three of them are still standing today.
You mentioned your mom. It was great getting to know her in the film and how important she is not only to the family, but to your dad's life and his ability to pursue what he wanted to do. So I want to acknowledge your mom in our conversation. And with that in mind, what was the reaction amongst your family, your immediate and extended family, to the film? What surprised you? What was most interesting about their reaction to the film?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for recognizing, my mom, because yeah, my mom is a force within herself. She's a scholar, and also is my dad's partner, filmmaking partner, as the writer and producer for most of his films. Having said that, I think my mom, my dad, my sister, we're very much used to either cameras always being around or kind of going on production shoots. It's really like second nature for us. So I think a lot of us were very comfortable on the camera and also very comfortable even seeing ourselves on camera. I think for, my wife, that is something new for her. She didn't grow up, in the same family. So I think it was at first a little uncomfortable with the camera. I mean, obviously, if you watch the film, my son is not shy at all. And even though he didn't, grow up like I did, my dad specifically, he obviously is very comfortable and at the same time is very comfortable watching himself too on the screen.
Just in terms of the extended family or even your immediate family, was there a specific reaction to it, the final product that you were surprised by, or just more kind of interesting the way people have reacted to it? Just kind of curious.
I think my sister purposely didn't want to see any cuts until the world premiere at Sundance. I think one of the first things she said to me, after the screening, she was like that she really liked it, but two, she said it wasn't the film she thought she was going to see. I think she did think it was going to be pretty much a tribute to my dad, a celebration of his accolades, and a portrait of an artist. But I don't think she was ready to see something so layered, especially, with myself in it. Everyone enjoyed it, but they thought the focus was just going to be on my dad and didn't expect it to include the rest of the family.
Congratulations on the film Third Act, and all the best to you, not only in your career as a filmmaker, but also in your role as a facilitator for filmmakers as well. I'm glad to see you're carrying on. That's great. That's great to hear.
Oh, thank you so much. No, really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, the film is Third Act. It is out this Friday, September 26th, and be looking for it. We've been speaking with the director and producer, Tadashi Nakamura. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.